I think I appreciated what the manager talked about. We're trying to do, I think, sustainable public policy here too, so that we can protect the long-term future of water public policy development, ownership, management, all the things that you all do. Let me start with thanking the interim committee. They heard a abbreviated version of this on Wednesday morning, and it was supposed to go about a half hour, and I think it went a little long. I thought that Chairman Vigil and Co-Chair Roberts, the committee had a lot of questions, and it gives you some idea. The response in this survey sort of demonstrates that people have a sense of the overall water plan, that there was one, but in general are now looking for implementation, and I think they were anxious to hear that. As you can see, we need to thank the Water Stewardship Project Board. They worked on the questionnaire. The Water Congress obviously authorizes it and moves it forward. But this year we had the Water Conservation Board participate both financially, and I'll talk about a few questions. James Eklund committed a few questions to us. The last time we did this was in 2013. As you can see down there, we did a sample of 500, so this was a bigger sample. I did it right after the national conventions, and where people were probably not watching that as much, because that definitely consumed the last couple of weeks of July. But our goal was, in 2013, we were very much responsive. We were looking at the public trust doctrine. We were looking at initiatives very directly. And while the Stewardship Project is still an advocacy project targeted at initiatives, we tried to be a lot more proactive in this particular survey. Try and think ahead of not just depending on what initiatives might be on the ballot, but how, as the water community communicates and as it organizes, can it see to it that it is able to counter any bad information that's put out there by various individuals or organizations, and just in general be ready on a public policy sense to be sustainable, to be able to maintain what is good about the water community, the laws, the approach we have in this state. So it's a lot more proactive. You'll see that we have a lot of questions about environmentalism and conservation here. Then with the state involved, we were very interested in looking at the state plan. We asked some questions last time about the state plan, but it was all about the process. And if you remember those responses, because the state talked about them a great deal, they were quite pleased with them, the public was overwhelmingly positive about the fact that you had been meeting for years in your basins, generating the kind of options and alternatives and data which ultimately went into the state plan. So they were very positive. So now you'll see some specific points on the state plan. And then finally, we were very much focused on implementation, including spending money, because I think theoretically that's where we're going to go. You know, we're all sort of listening to a lot of discussion as to whether or not that can be done with public-private partnerships. Can it be done with, we just had a webinar in which foundation money was talked about. But ultimately, most of you are going to ratepayers to help pay for your projects, but at some point the state, are they going to be interested and able to step up and make a significant contribution? And that's, of course, what the legislature was especially interested in. And then finally, there are some, which I didn't present to them particularly, but I've got some information in this about communication. Because as Doug pointed out, our next step here probably is to, for those of you who sat through some of the California presentations, is to get a lot more engaged in terms of communication and using you as institutions for communication. You can see very quickly the difference there. While water conservation and supplies are still at the top of the list, notice water quality and water pollution, drinking water quality, moved way up. In the case of drinking water quality, 3 times what it was in 13. A 50% increase in pollution. And notice then the drop in both storage and drought, for example. And that is the sense that I think the public out there believes that we're in a water-richer environment today, so that their common sense feel about it, and also what we're telling them on a regular basis is that there is somewhat less concern about a drought or storage. Notice we still are always worried about losing water downstream. We have concerns about agriculture, and you'll see another question here shortly as to how important agriculture is. Still some concern on fracking, and we'll talk about that when we get to ballot issues. Notice that we feel good in this state. And I noticed in a survey that I did in the Denver metro area, that right direction indicator was very close to 60%. Statewide, it is above 60%. And then when you look at the federal government, it's in the 20s. And that goes to that disconnect we're watching in our politics right now of our lack of happiness concerning federal officials. Here is a question that we had in 2013 and then one in 2016, and you can see there's a 10-point drop-off in concern about storage or shortage over the next 10 years or the need for more storage, although you will notice that those are still at 50%, so that more than half the public or half the public still believes that we need to make investments. This, I think, is a very important question. The last time we did this, we asked more of a favorability question, and your favorability as water providers was quite high. This time we asked it in terms of handling the environment and protecting the environment. And that is a question that was framed by Gallup. For example, the president has a 54% rating in protecting the environment. Well, as you can see, your local water provider here, many of you, have a 64%, county government, 51%. The state, it's still 2-to-1, 22% to 44, but obviously lower, and then state legislature, they were impressed just Wednesday. And then, of course, we really don't like the federal government. Now, you could be sitting here saying, well, that's because they do too much that's wrong, or that they don't do enough that's right. So there's a variety of ways you might be unhappy, but just in general, we're not happy with the federal government. Now, somebody on the committee, maybe Chris Treese or somebody said, well, does anybody know their local water provider? And we thought that was a good question. So we asked that, could you name your water provider? And 70% of these people said they could. And then I said, fine, then describe it. And as you can see, we got 63% said city and town, special district, I have my own well, a variety of other things, and only 11% didn't know. So I thought that they had a decent general description of who their water provider is, you will also see a further question, believe are credible on the question of water issues. Is your local water supplier encouraging conservation? And about half the public here said yes, 53%. As you can see, 12% said excellent and 12% said poor. So there's probably more that can be done. But in general, you had a positive image there, a public perception. From my point of view, conservation is sort of a litmus test. If you don't have some credibility of it, or if you can't start your conversation in terms of public policy talking about conservation, you're probably not going to get too far down the road with a lot of the public. They want to know you're doing that. But once you get there, at least you have a decent platform here to start. You have some credibility, a majority at least do. We asked why. This was a question that Doug came up with. What are your reasons for conserving? And as you can see, number one is sort of what our building manager was talking about here, not our building manager, but the hotel food manager, and that is ethics. It's ethical. It's the right thing to do, and that's what people said is their main motivation. Then in general, just generically protect the environment, more water in rivers, more water in storage. Again, conservation is a part of our language now as it is part of our public policy. But I like to call it conservation realism. That is to say that those individuals who periodically say all we need is conservation, the public does not agree. The public believes that there also needs to be a water development, whether it's, in this case, we talk about storage, but many of you look at various options. But that conservation alone is not sufficient to deal with our shortages and our long-term problems. I've asked that question twice now, and in both cases, they believe that conservation is essential, but not a silver bullet. And I think that's good for you because while for some people you can never do enough, and in point of view, that's their philosophical, ideological position. But fortunately, most of the public, when they see a good faith effort, when they see your effort, they still can then move on to looking at what else you're offering. And in some cases, you're offering to raise their rates. In some cases, you're offering to borrow some money. In some cases, you're offering to be involved in a long-term permitting process. We had 20% last time who said that they visited your website, so that you have at least some digital interaction out there. But I have been doing now here in the metro area for various campaigns. I'm working on a political campaign in the Denver metro area to make sure that I'm investing my advertising dollars in the right mediums. And quite frankly, in the last 4 years, digital has now, online has now overtaken television. And so that we're still not doing 50-50. We still think the television is more powerful in our advertising, but nonetheless, we're putting now a third of our advertising money into digital. And I have no doubt that if you look at many of these significant campaigns, Mr. Bennett's, who has a lot of money, and Ms. Clinton, that they are putting far more than they ever have online, and that I think is a good message for you. Notice when you're also going on news, you should be both on cable and network because it's now divided between the two of them. Now, interesting, read community newspapers regularly. Most of us, we don't necessarily think of that as a communication or a advertising medium, but it was especially true in the suburbs in this survey. It was especially true in rural areas, and so it's something to, that's a powerful vehicle for you out there. So that while newspapers are in trouble, because of their not being able to charge quite as much online and being pushed digitally. Nonetheless, local newspapers probably have never been more powerful in terms of being vehicles for both advertising but also communicating, and often putting in ads that then link them to your digital activities, to your electronic town halls, and all the other things that you're doing. I asked one question. This was a national style question, just to get a sense of what are the environmental concerns here. And notice I used great deal because there was somewhat less. I had a variety of response categories there, great deal, fair amount, etc. And I just put down great deal. Global warming was a little bigger here in Colorado than it was nationally. Notice we've kind of solved air pollution. Notice our census, that's moved down that list. Notice on the endangered species issue, you heard Senator Bennett say, I don't think it can change. I believe that well, that's true, because while it's a little bit further down this list, that 32% feel very passionate about it, and obviously changes in endangered species at the legislative level would be very, very difficult. Notice pollution is high, contamination is high, so we are in sort of a toxic moment to some extent. The public is extremely sensitive to their water qualities. I asked a follow-up question. This again is a national styled question. The public in general nationally is just as polarized as we are. There were a few more people nationally and generally correct. But notice that when you start talking about global warming, and we all do periodically, or climate change, the public immediately, some part of the public says that is just a conspiracy of the left, and some part says that is directly the most moral, most important thing that we are dealing with today. So we have a lot of polarization on it. The one thing that I think is useful about it is that when we talk about it, the public does not say that means you should do nothing in terms of water development. When I ask them, this is the second time I've asked that question about do you think it'll require more storage, less, or have no effect on the amount of water that should be stored, their presumption, their position in terms of just a default position is more storage. So that is to say, I interpret that as saying, take action. Just because we would agree that there's climate change, know that there's going to be some differences, it still suggests to take action. The next question is something that the state helps sponsor. Have you seen, or does the state have a role in planning? Also, our committee suggested some language change. The last time I asked this, I said, who should control water? Should it be at the local level or the state level? And we were very biased toward the local level, as we usually are in this state. We wanted local control. This time we went with, as you can see, believe planning should be conducted by the local city, town, or water district, by state government or the federal government. Well, needless to say, we're not interested in the federal government, but on the other hand, after 2 years of intense planning, 9 months that there's a plan out there, and as you know, the plan represents more than a decade of activity that you've been involved with, I think we now have a sense that the state has a role in water planning. As I told that committee when I first was working for a congressman, Frank Evans said, Floyd, let's do a little study on water in Colorado, because he was very, very active in water funding. He was on the Appropriations Committee of Interior for funding water projects, and we had a lot of them in southern Colorado, including still getting money for the Fry Arc, but also the Animas La Plata. So I came to the state, and I poked around a little bit, and I met with Felix Sparks, who was at that point still sort of in charge of state planning, and said, so where's the state plan? He said, there isn't one. You can take a look at all these plans here, and there's some plans here, but by and large, planning was based on projects, and it was based at the local level, but there was no state plan. So now we have one, and I think the public, however, is not particularly aware that we have one, and this is also of important information for the state, because what it says is that these 9 months, the introduction of it in September, and the talking about it and our being interested in it and my polling on it is fine, but the public in general, only 19% were able to say anything about it. They were more rural, outside the metro area and the Front Range. There were more people. They were more attentive. They were more connected. They read more newspapers, etc. They were a little older, which is fine. That means that sort of we call it grass tops, so the people that are very important to us in terms of motivating public opinion at the local level. And nonetheless, the public in general is not very aware of it. I then asked them to rate it, and as you can see, half declined. But of the half, and that's some people who don't know much about it, obviously, but of the half who rated it, it came off pretty positive. That's about 2 to 1 in favor, but believing had a favorable impression of the plan. And given that we know that they liked, when I described the process, that they liked that, and also given that at least there's a presumption that it's pretty good. There's not, there's 4% said very unfavorable, which is about the same as the very favorable, but as you can see, the somewhat favorable was better, was stronger, and I think obviously the 54% are kind of neutral on it. It means that it also starts at a pretty positive platform. Now, this is a question that I reviewed with the state, and then the follow-up question is a question that the state designed. But in this question, I was trying to get to, well, just thinking generically of some of the points that are made in the plan or that have been discussed related to the plan. Or do you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree? And I only took the strongly agrees, which I focused on, and then I show you the somewhat agree. But personally, in my political analysis, I normally look at the strongly, because that's where the passion is. If I see that number is over 50% or close to 50%, that says that you start in a pretty strong position to go forth and do something. And repeatedly, the public wants its share of water. So that was asked the last time, and it was equally positive in 2013. I didn't put it up there because it played the same in 2013, but I also asked, and it turned out in second position, do you want to protect and preserve irrigated agriculture? And that came out at 58% strongly agreed. I just didn't put it up. Notice permitting should be expedited. You saw Eric Wilkerson and the American Rivers and EPA and everybody joining James yesterday discussing permitting. And I framed a question related to that, mentioning 10 years. The permitting should be expedited to get the projects built. As you can see, there is a public sort of presumption of, yes, follow the law, get the permit, but let's get it done. It shouldn't be that this delay should not be related to a bad process. So that it sort of endorses at a minimum, the lean process, and to some extent, even to the federal government, which, as you know, wasn't seated up there, particularly other than EPA, which in some cases is not the key player. In terms of running these things so slow. And as you know, at least partially they run so slow because of resource issues in terms of how many people they have on the projects or how often those individuals change. Notice water conservation right up there. Once again, the kind of issue, if you're going to have a dialogue with the public, you have to have that on your list. Notice new water facilities at 45%. My general rule is that you can take maybe about half, depending on what the level of opposition is. You can take about half of those people that say they somewhat agree and move them over, so that you would be starting at the upper 50% level in terms of a dialogue about new storage facilities. Wastewater. I tried to come up with every word that made wastewater, this concept, the public would have to think about it, not just, oh yes, reuse, that's wonderful. So I used wastewater. It'll be expensive to do this. To make it safe, I put the word safe in there so they would be thinking about it. And yet with all of that, as you can see, we're at 43%. And again, if you took a decent 50% share or so of somewhat, you would be above 50%. That is to say, reuse today can be put on the table, can be discussed, I think, with the public. And then finally, the state was obviously very interested, and the legislators, with this last question, and that is there a ghost of Ref A out there someplace? That was, as you know, that was like 13 years ago when we did that. Started very popular. I took surveys in January and March, 60% plus level, and by the time it was over, it passed no county. It was about closest in Douglas, and I mentioned Logan, and Sonnenberg smiled because he remembered that. It was close in a few counties that are very water sensitive, but on the other hand, it lost everywhere. And that dynamic took place in about 8 or 9 months when the dialogue turned against it, and it was defeated. Are we in a better place today? Well, this would suggest that we probably started a platform where we can have at least a good dialogue about it, primarily because you have spent a decade discussing it. We have a plan now, and if the process of constructing something to go to the public was similar to the process of constructing a plan, I think we would have the public at least willing to listen to it. And then the state offered this question, and that is we've identified a series of projects and programs necessary over the next 20 years and beyond to ensure an adequate supply of water and to close the water shortfall. These projects will require, and programs will require additional funds. As I read the following list, tell me, once again, strongly support, somewhat support. Well, for those of you who love planning and going to meetings, good news, the public strongly supports it. It's also probably the least expensive thing on this list. Water conservation programs, also very strong. Just reinforcing, and I won't say it again, but just reinforcing something you already know and are doing. Enhancing river habitat. So notice all the 50s and above are kind of on the either planning or environmental side. So almost everything we are doing, we have to keep doing. And for those who need to develop new water supplies or storage projects, then I think those are criteria that you'd have to put in any big statewide plan, for example, and you would probably even need to put those type of elements in your basin type of plans and your local plans, whether your whatever $500 million projects you're thinking of, and that's nowadays seem to be the threshold for a project. So you'd need those top three of some element of those: environmental questions, really good planning, good conservation, but then also you could then go into actually pouring some concrete and doing some engineering. Notice recreation. As you know, there's a lot of people that feel very intensely about recreation. We often mention it in our projects, but on the other hand, like school districts, if a school district says we need a big bond initiative and it's going to be for a new gym and a pool, you're probably in trouble. You better tell them, we're going to build a pool, but by the way, there's going to be new classrooms, lots of new technology, and today, you know what the big item is in school districts that they have to spend a lot of money on? Security. Cameras, doors, bulletproof glass, many things that are now relatively new in the last decade. But I'm just pointing out that you can do recreation, but you have to do everything else. You have to make the case that we need renewable water. We need sustainable water. We need a water supply that'll get us down the road for 30 years, get us to 2050. 35 years. Now here's the sort of the final good news that goes with that very first piece I put up there in terms of the credibility of local water providers on the question of the environment, and the fact that you've got a decent platform of believability on conservation. I asked, who do you believe is most credible about providing facts about water supply, quality, etc.? And number one, most credible: water districts. State government I didn't ask the last time, but water districts and ag I asked last time on who would be most credible to provide information, believable information on public trust. Because at that point we were testing a specific ballot issue that we were worried about, initiative. And once they were both very high up, water districts and ag. This time I added state government. You can see they're high up. But interestingly, the three of them were higher than environmental organizations, which had, as you can see, a few people that didn't find them very credible, and then higher than county commissioners. And same as last time, our poor local newspapers and their editorial pages are at the bottom. And I really like Vince Carroll and now Chuck Plunkett, but I think they're aware of the fact, which is why the editorial page now in the Denver Post is on the back page behind the obits, which most of you probably get to the obits. You may not turn the paper to the editorial page. I do, and some of you do, I know, but it's probably a lot of people jump immediately to sports. Finally, let me put up the ballot issues. These are the ones we tested, and since I prepared this slide, primary election and presidential elections are now on the ballot. That check mark is on the ballot. Single payer, I believe, will lose. It has been at about those numbers. I tested it in June in a survey in the Denver metro area, and those were about the numbers. So their yes is not moving up, and as you know, their support level in the progressive community has pretty much collapsed. A lot of progressive and Democratic interests have come out against it. I don't think Bernie Sanders will turn that around with his endorsement. Raise the bar. Doug mentioned this, and you've maybe heard some presentations. We did a webinar on it at the Water Congress and Stewardship Project, and it has some work ahead of it. As you can see, it is just a lot of people, a third of the public don't understand it, don't know. So if there's a campaign against it, it'll probably really have to work very hard to get people to vote yes. And probably one of the things I would worry about if I was on the ballot right now is this sort of whoosh in the negative sense. Does it start with single payer, people saying no to that, and then moving down the ballot, not wanting change or not just being in a good mood? As you know, this is the classic not good mood election going on here. Notice we tested mandatory setback and anti-fracking. That's the 2,500 foot rule. Interestingly, for all the work that the gas and oil industry has done since 2014, you've seen the ads, you've seen the organizations. there is still just sort of a superficial presumption when I read that little ballot issue that, gosh, that sounds like a good idea. So in other words, these two items, in my opinion, won't make the ballot because they didn't turn in enough signatures. But had they been on the ballot, Gas and Oil would have had to work very hard to tell people, I think correctly, that this was essentially a ban. And generally speaking, the public does not support a ban. But obviously the ballot language doesn't say ban, it just says 2,500 feet, and that sounds sort of reasonable. And so as you can see, it got 57% there. I do think all that effort of theirs, and to some extent it corresponds to the kind of effort that I think the water community needs to make in terms of constant public education. I think that helped undermine them getting those signatures because they never found a rich person that would buy them. So they, for the most part, had to depend upon the local passion, the local activists. And quite frankly, along the Front Range, North Front Range in particular, there was just a lot less of that. Partially that's a fall off in gas and oil activity, partially it's their advertising, but I do think that it gives you some idea that ballot issues like these can pass. Primary election, I don't have a sense of that. My personal opinion is that they would like to get unaffiliated voters into primary elections, and parties often oppose that. The public might have a presumption for it. It sort of seems fair. Let unaffiliateds vote. I think some of the newspaper editorial pages will be in favor of it. State minimum wage at $12, putting it in the Constitution, putting an inflation factor with it. We now have one in the Constitution much lower with an inflation factor. I didn't think that was a good idea to start with, but they tend to be popular. And of course they can argue, well, it's not $15, what a bargain. I think there might be a presumption that that would pass. The presidential election, a primary instead of the caucuses. The caucuses this time sort of teed that up. As you know, the Democrats had chaos. So many people showed up, they couldn't route them in the right places. Lots of the young people just came and voted for Bernie Sanders and left. So it was pretty messy out there because the parties have to do it all themselves with volunteers. And the Republicans, as you recall, held a caucus with no people. And so consequently, we're endlessly criticized by Mr. Trump that it's rigged, it's rigged, it's rigged. They didn't have a preference poll. They obviously had some people show up, but no preference poll. So I think probably my sense is that we're ready for a presidential primary. As you know, we did them for about a decade. Often no one shows up because it's an incumbent president or it's already been decided by the time we vote someplace in March. So it'll be expensive, but it looks to me like it probably has some popularity. While this is about the world's highest cigarette tax that I'm familiar with, they may be higher in New York or someplace. I think it's about $2.50. We generally have been comfortable with taxing cigarettes. And then medical aid and dying, that will be interesting. As you know, it's passed several states. But there are still organizations, particularly the Catholic Church, for example, and others that will oppose it. So we'll have to see. I'll probably do a statewide survey for DU. I teach at DU now, and I think we're going to try and do a DU survey. So to just close out here, we've shifted our attention from shortage to quality. It sort of suggests to you that you have to be flexible. You have to know what's in the news. Obviously, you're always concerned about water quality. There is no way, the reaction that the public has to water quality problems is visceral and immediate, and they want help, and they often are in a blame mode. So being conscious of that and being ready to move at any time is important. But shortage is still out there in their mind. And remember, half or more of the public still feels that we're going to have a shortage in 10 years, and as you well know, we could be back in a drought at any time, and already still have some areas have conditions. You have local credibility on handling the environment. That's a great platform to have. You have to work on it. You have to build on it. There's a balanced view on conservation, but it is a litmus test issue. You can't get to the conversation unless you have some credibility on it, and a little more can be done. Obviously, the state is now a partner in water planning. I don't think they'll be the dominant player, but they're an asset and an ally for you, in my opinion. People believe that joint planning should continue. The public is ready for implementation. Almost everything. We've been through this list with them, and they like reuse and structures and new water and conservation. I would suggest that the key is communication and leadership. And I mentioned this to the legislature, and I could see them nod. And what I said was that our grandchildren right now, in about 2050, will be about 40 years old. And they're going to they're going to think that we were extremely negligent. You familiar with that word? It was used by a FBI director recently. Extremely negligent if we don't step up and address this water gap, this shortage that we have identified overwhelmingly in these studies and talked about for several years now. And in addition to that, what this survey suggests is if we're not proactive, if we don't take action, if we don't move forward, then we will continue to be vulnerable to really ill-conceived, ill-drafted ballot initiatives. And so it is in our interest to keep moving forward and keep the public focused on the fact that we are taking action, both from the planning point of view, but also proposing things. You're doing that at the local level. When I finished up with the legislators, I told them, I mean, can you believe what's going on, just for example, the Front Range, the $1 billion plus Southern Delivery System, the $500 million NISP and just getting Windy Gap, Moffett, all the things going on, the Aurora's Prairie Waters, and then the WISE project. Just add them up, by and large being paid for by ratepayers. So a lot is going on, which sits on top of huge planning, in some cases tremendous permitting processes. So there's a lot going on. But I'm just sort of suggesting that what this survey recommends is tying it all together and possibly making the state our partner on it. I will stop with that. Doug, I have some political slides for those of you who want to go on and talk politics, but let me stop for a moment and take any questions that you might have on this particular survey, which was a big survey, 700. People were grumpy, is what my field service said. Oh, they were grumpy, Floyd. It's a grumpy year. The Trump people are not happy. I think people in general are not happy. So we got them through it. It took probably an extra day or day and a half to get everybody through it, but we made it.
Great. Do we have any questions for Floyd over here? Hang on just one second. Let me get you the mic. Rachel.
Thank you so much. Your presentations and polling are always really very, very interesting. I am wondering, the terminology storage is used repeatedly, but not there we go. But not the term trans-mountain diversions. And is there a reason that you were not asking about trans-mountain diversions along with storage, or the term trans-mountain diversions just was not there?
It wasn't, we could have put it in, we just didn't. The committee looked it over, the state looked it over. I have seen a lot of surveys with trans-mountain diversion, and it's a term that you almost have to define for the public a little more thoroughly, whereas storage is kind of generic. It can be within your own basin. It could be connected to trans-mountain diversion. So that's sort of the question. Oh, I think it's a separate question, but I think if you put it in there, here's the question that I have asked. You can see the question that I've asked repeatedly. Do you think that we should store our water that we have a legal title and right to? And the answer is, as you can see repeatedly, it's in the 90% range if I put in both somewhat and strongly. Then my follow-up question has been, and where do you think we should be able to use that water if we store it? Do you think we should be able to use it on the Front Range, on the Western Slope, in all basins, et cetera, et cetera? And on that question, and I haven't asked it in maybe 5 to 10 years, it's been a while, but on that question, people would say, well, everybody should have a right to use it. On the other hand, I've seen a recent Western Slope survey that asked specifically trans-basin. I've seen a survey out of Colorado College, and they asked a very specific question, and on that there's really very, very little support for trans-mountain diversion. But my personal view is you could probably frame one in some way that would get the people to at least dialogue about it. As you know, in terms of this plan, we don't even get close to dialoguing about it unless there's this huge consensus, all kinds of triggers. It would be a huge process to even get that on a ballot initiative. In my view, if we had a Ref A, it would not be discussing trans-mountain diversion. It would be discussing sort of local remedies with everybody getting some type of share, the type of thing we see when transportation planning is done in this state. Which, by the way, ahead of water, I think the transportation community, represented by the county commissioners, they are anxious to move forward with some type of initiative, probably linked to a sales tax. I'm just sort of suggesting water probably ought to be there. That in point of fact, we've kind of teed this up in a way with this incredible process you guys have done. But that by and large, you've probably lined up, what, $2 to $3 billion worth of projects that are either underway or near being finished or in some cases still in permitting in the last decade since we had the great drought, the old three type of drought situation. Where does the next $3 billion come from? We go back to the ratepayers, and are some of you big enough to go back to your ratepayers and say, by the way, we have a $50 to $100 million project here? Or do we think about what California has just done in their drought, or Texas did about 3 years ago, and that is put an initiative on the ballot. Texas did it in a way they had a surplus fund and they dedicated that to it. We have to be creative here in terms of thinking about this if we decide to move forward. I'm not saying it's straightforward. This is not a linear process. But I do think that both the need and the kind of the social infrastructure has been put in place by what you all have done over the past decade.
Floyd, we have one more question.
Yep.
And we're going to have to move on.
If I saw the numbers right, Floyd, 80% of the public does not know about the Colorado State Water Plan? Is that correct?
That's correct. Right.
That's a little scary.
Kind of. I'm working on a political campaign in Denver. It's related to the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, which I know everything about. It raises $50 million a year. The money goes to the zoo and the Natural History Museum. We talk about it endlessly. All the institutions talk about it. It's a polar bear tax. And about 15% of the public could tell me what it was. So that by and large, your attentive public is, and it is your attentive public. As I mentioned to you, it was stronger in the rural areas. It was stronger among those people with more connectivity, that is to say, a little more education, dealing with the media on a regular basis, which is not bad. That means those grass tops, those individuals that you talk to on a regular basis, were more attentive to it. But you are right, absolutely. The public is not familiar with it. Needless to say, if we started taking the next step over the next year and talking about trying to craft some type of package, or if there's some legislation in general that's going to follow out of this related to water conservation, water usage, I think we will get a lot more attentive public. But just issuing a plan, ask yourself, for those of you who are in more rural or non-metro basins, that you could probably say your Rotary is familiar with it, your Chamber of Commerce is familiar with it, your City Council is familiar with it, particularly those people that have been around for a while. Wouldn't you have to spend some time educating a new City Council person about it? I'll bet you would. And so that's essentially what goes on in this, and that is that the attentive people are following it, but even for them, it decays if they're not dealing with it on a regular basis. The good news, however, is that you have a lot of credibility on it. And so does the state, frankly, and so does the governor. I point that out, and that is that our governor, at least in my view, is possibly an individual who may be asked to go to Washington, D.C. He has said he's not looking for it, and I understand that. But as you know, Mr. Salazar is in charge of saying who's going to go to Washington, D.C., or at least he's going to have a lot of influence on it. Our governor has some talent in some areas, commerce, energy, interior, a variety of places. He may want to go. He was a water governor. He's the person who said, let's get this plan going. Let's get Stolp in this office. And so consequently, while we have him, we should keep this dialogue going, because we ourselves are going to have to do a level of education with whatever the new leadership is that comes in after him. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Floyd.